The hospital bracelet was still on my wrist when I walked back into a house that no longer felt like home. It was December 24th, Christmas Eve, and the tree we had decorated together 3 weeks earlier stood in the corner of the living room, blinking its soft gold lights against the dark. I had picked that tree. I had driven 40 minutes to a farm outside the city because Natalie said she wanted a real one this year, not artificial, because this Christmas would be special. Our first Christmas as parents. She had been 8 months pregnant then, glowing and laughing, reaching up on her toes to hang an ornament shaped like a tiny baby shoe. I stood in the doorway holding our son, Owen, wrapped in a hospital blanket, 5 days old, impossibly small, and completely unaware that his mother had chosen not to come home with us. I will not pretend I handled it with grace. I sat down on the couch, Owen pressed against my chest, and I wept. Not the quiet, dignified kind of weeping that men are permitted in movies. The ugly, heaving kind, where your whole body convulses and you can't breathe properly, and the sounds you make don't seem like sounds a human being should make. The Christmas lights kept blinking. Owen slept through all of it. Let me go back to the beginning, or at least to the part of the beginning that matters. My name is Ryan Caldwell. I grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio, the son of a high school history teacher and a woman who ran a small alterations shop from our garage. We were not poor, but we were never far enough from poor that we could forget it was nearby. I learned early how to stretch a dollar, how to fix things instead of replace them, and how to find satisfaction in work that was honest and slow. I met Natalie Souza when I was 26. She was waitressing at a bar where I watched football on Sunday afternoons, and she had the kind of energy that made a room feel brighter simply because she was standing in it. She laughed easily. She remembered people's names. She leaned across the bar when she talked to you, like whatever you were saying was the most interesting thing she'd heard all week. I was completely done for. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. We married in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard in September, and for a while, everything was exactly what I had always wanted. I was working as a project manager for a mid-level construction firm, earning decent money, saving carefully, building towards something. We bought a house, modest, but ours. We talked about children. We talked about the future with the particular intoxicating recklessness of two people who believe they are immune to tragedy. The cracks, when they came quietly. I don't think Natalie was a bad person. I've had years now to think about it, and I've arrived at something more complicated than blame. She was restless in ways I didn't fully understand. She had grown up dreaming of a version of life that looked a certain way. The vacations, the restaurants, the clothes, the ease of never checking a price tag. I knew this about her abstractly, but I didn't realize how much it lived in her bones until the years started to pass, and the life we had built began to feel, to her, like a ceiling. She started working at a marketing firm about 18 months into our marriage. The firm had corporate clients, real estate developers, tech startups, investment groups. She was good at her job, and she moved up quickly, and the world she moved through began to diverge from the world I moved through. Her colleagues flew business class and took clients to restaurants where the wine cost more than my weekly grocery budget. She started coming home later. She started talking about her work with a brightness that she no longer had when she talked about us. I noticed. I tried to talk about it. She told me I was insecure. Maybe I was. Maybe I was also right. His name was Preston Holt. I found out about him the way men usually find out. Not through some dramatic confrontation, but through a small, stupid accident. A notification that appeared on a shared tablet while she was in the shower. A name I didn't recognize attached to a message I was never meant to see. I'm not going to detail what the message said. It's enough to say it was not ambiguous. By the time I found out about Preston Holt, Natalie was 7 months pregnant. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I think people often assume the worst about how men respond to betrayal, and I want to be honest about how I actually responded. I didn't rage. I didn't break things. I went very, very still. I sat with what I knew for 4 days before I said anything, And in those 4 days, I did something that would turn out to matter enormously. I called my cousin Kevin, who is an attorney. I told him what I had found. I told him I needed to understand my options before I said a single word to my wife. Kevin told me to document everything. He told me to open my own bank account immediately. He told me to photograph the assets in the house, to make copies of our financial documents, and to do all of this before any conversation that might accelerate events I couldn't control. I did exactly that, quietly, calmly, while my pregnant wife went to work and came home and sat across from me at the dinner table and acted as though nothing had changed. When I finally confronted her, she did not deny it. She cried. She told me she was sorry. She told me that Preston made her feel a way she couldn't explain, that she had tried to stop it, that she didn't know what she wanted. I asked her one question. Is the baby mine? She said yes. She has never wavered on that. Owen has my eyes, my ears, and apparently my inexplicable love of falling asleep during television programs I specifically requested. He is mine in every way that counts. But Natalie was honest in other ways too. She told me she didn't want to stay. She told me that Preston had asked her to be with him, that he had a world he wanted to show her, and that she was afraid if she didn't go, she would spend the rest of her life wandering. She said she was sorry. She said she still cared about me. She said she hoped we could co-parent well. She said a lot of things that were technically true and functionally devastating. We agreed she would stay through the birth. That was perhaps foolish of me. Perhaps I still hoped she would change her mind, but I couldn't face the alternative. She went into labour on December 19th. Owen was born at 4:47 in the morning on December 20th, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, furious and perfect. On December 22nd, Natalie told a nurse she was going to step out for some air. She never came back to the room. She had texted me by the time I realised she was gone. I'm so sorry, Ryan. I love Owen. I'll call soon. Please take care of him. I drove home on Christmas Eve with my 5-day-old son and no idea how to feed him, bathe him, or survive the next 24 hours, let alone the rest of my life. The weeks that followed Christmas were the hardest of my life, and I say that having later navigated a divorce, a custody battle, and a period of financial strain that required me to sell my truck and borrow money from my parents, the hardness of that early period was different. It was physical and total and relentless in a way that left no room for self-pity, because self-pity requires leisure, and there is no leisure with a newborn. My mother arrived on December 26th and stayed for 3 weeks. I don't know what I would have done without her. She taught me how to swaddle, how to distinguish a hungry cry from an overtired cry, how to get through a 3 a.m. feeding without accidentally falling asleep with the baby on my chest. She cooked. She cleaned. She didn't ask me how I was feeling, which was the kindest thing she could have done, because I didn't have any answer that wouldn't have destroyed both of us. I went back to work in late January. My boss, a gruff and practical man named Bill Ostrowski, had heard enough through the grapevine to treat me with an unusual gentleness. He moved some of my project load. He didn't ask questions. When I needed to leave early for pediatric appointments, he waved me out without comment. I've never told him how much that meant. Owen went to daycare at 8 weeks old. I sat in the parking lot on his first day and cried for the second time since Christmas. Then I drove to work. I have to tell you about Preston Holt, because he is central to what happened next, and because understanding him matters. Preston Holt was 44 years old, divorced once, with 2 teenage daughters from his first marriage who lived primarily with their mother. He had made his money in commercial real estate. Not a self-made story exactly, as his father had given him his start, but he had expanded considerably on what he'd inherited. He drove a car that cost more than my annual salary. He had a lake house. He had a penthouse in the city. He was not, by any measure I could identify, a bad-looking man. He was also, as I would gradually come to understand, someone who moved through life with the particular carelessness of a person who has never had to absorb the full consequences of their choices. He had pursued my pregnant wife with no apparent hesitation. He had helped her leave a man holding a newborn baby on Christmas Eve. These facts told me something about his character that no amount of lake houses could contradict. Natalie called on New Year's Day. She wanted to talk about custody. She was staying with Preston, she said, at the penthouse for now. She wanted to see Owen, of course she did. She wanted to be part of his life. She hoped we could work something out without lawyers. I told her, very calmly, that everything would go through Kevin. She seemed surprised by this. I think she expected grief, or anger, or a desperate willingness to accommodate whatever she wanted in exchange for some version of closeness. What she got instead was a man who had spent the past 10 days not sleeping and not eating and not feeling anything except the weight of his son in his arms and the cold clarity of knowing exactly what he needed to do. Kevin was extraordinary. He filed for primary custody immediately, citing abandonment. He documented the circumstances of Owen's first days, the hospital records, the date Natalie left, the text message. He hired a forensic accountant to examine our joint finances and discovered that over the previous 8 months, Natalie had moved approximately $23,000 from our joint account into a personal account I hadn't known existed. Money that had come, technically, from both of us. Money I had worked for. That discovery changed the temperature of everything. Natalie had assumed, I think, that I would be too heartbroken and overwhelmed to look closely, that I would sign what I was handed and be grateful for whatever scraps of arrangement she offered, that Preston's lawyers, and she had Preston's lawyers, would simply outmaneuver a grieving construction project manager from Ohio and his cousin the attorney. She was wrong about Kevin. Kevin was relentless and methodical and deeply, personally offended on my behalf, which made him, I think, a better advocate than he would have been otherwise. The $23,000 was not nothing. In the settlement negotiations, it became a lever. Combined with the abandonment filing and the documented timeline, we were in a far stronger position than Natalie's team had anticipated. Preston's lawyers were corporate attorneys, excellent at what they did, which had nothing to do with family law. They made mistakes. Kevin did not. We were in mediation for 4 months. There were days I sat across a table from Natalie and tried to reconcile the person I was looking at with the person I had stood next to at an altar, promising things I had intended to keep forever. She looked different. She had a new haircut, new clothes. She looked like someone who belonged to a different life, which I suppose was the point. I did not hate her. I want to be clear about that, not because it makes me sound virtuous, but because it's true. What I felt was something more like grief and bewilderment. The particular bewilderment of realizing that the story you believed you were living was never quite the story that was actually happening. I also never, not once, used Owen as a weapon. I said this to Kevin early on, and I meant it. Owen was not leverage. Owen was a child who needed his mother and his father both, and whatever I felt about Natalie's choices, I was not willing to damage my son to punish his mother. I've watched men do that. I watched it in my own extended family when I was a child. I know what it costs the children, and I refused. The settlement we reached was this: primary physical custody with me, with Natalie having generous and structured visitation, every other weekend, alternating holidays, 2 weeks in the summer. The $23,000 was factored into the division of assets, effectively coming back to me through the equity settlement on the house. Natalie waived any claim to my retirement accounts, which had grown more than she'd realized over the years of my careful, unglamorous saving. She received no spousal support, which her lawyers had initially requested, and which Kevin had methodically dismantled by documenting her new financial circumstances. Preston Holt, to his credit, did not interfere in the legal proceedings. He stayed entirely out of it, which I respected in the abstract, while also noting that it meant Natalie fought that battle largely without him at her side. Draw your own conclusions. The divorce was finalized in June. Owen was 6 months old. He had begun by then to smile. I want to tell you what happened to me in the year that followed, because this is the part people usually skip to, the recovery, the triumph, the proof that things got better, and I don't want to rush it, because the truth is that getting better was slow and strange and nothing like the montage sequence it sounds like in summary. I started running. Not for any romantic reason. I started running because Owen went to bed at 7:30, and I had a monitor and a fenced backyard and 2 hours to fill before I could reasonably go to sleep myself, and sitting alone in a quiet house with my thoughts was not a sustainable activity. Running was something to do with my body, while my mind worked through things it needed to work through. I ran badly at first, then less badly. By autumn, I was running 5 miles in the early mornings, before Owen woke up, while the neighborhood was still dark and the air smelled like wet leaves. I lost weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I slept better. I started cooking actual meals, instead of whatever I'd been doing in those early months, which my mother had described, charitably, as creative use of frozen foods. I read books. Embarrassing to admit, maybe, but I had stopped reading somewhere in the middle of the marriage, stopped making time for it, stopped believing I deserved the leisure of it, and picking it back up felt like reclaiming something I hadn't known was gone. I made friends, which sounds simpler than it was. I joined a parent group at Owen's daycare. I met a man named Thomas, a single father of twin girls, who had been through his own version of the unraveling marriage and came out the other side with a wry, rueful humor that I found enormously comforting. Thomas became my closest friend in the way that men sometimes find their closest friendships in their 30s, suddenly, out of necessity, and with a gratitude that is almost embarrassing in its intensity. I also, and I say this carefully, began to let myself feel proud. Not proud in a chest-puffing way. Proud in the quieter way of someone who has done something genuinely hard and survived it intact. I had held my newborn son alone in a house decorated for a Christmas that didn't happen. I had learned to swaddle and to soothe and to navigate the labyrinth of pediatric care and daycare waitlists and sick days and sleep regressions. I had done my job. I had fought for my son's custody and won. I had protected myself financially when I could have been destroyed financially. I had not, in any of it, done anything that I would be ashamed to tell Owen about someday. That last part mattered more than anything. Owen is 3 now. He is loud and opinionated and obsessed with garbage trucks in a way that I find both baffling and endearing. He calls me Daddy, which still does something to my chest every single time. He calls Natalie Mama, and he loves her, which is exactly what I wanted, because she is his mother and she loves him, and the arrangement, strange as it is, has found its footing. Natalie and I are not friends. I don't think we will be, and I've stopped imagining some future in which we laugh warmly over coffee about the people we used to be. But we are functional. We communicate about Owen clearly and without cruelty. We have managed 2 Christmases and 3 birthdays and a minor medical scare without a single incident that Owen will carry with him. That is not nothing. That is, honestly, more than I feared was possible in those first months. Preston Holt is still in the picture. He and Natalie got engaged last year. Owen calls him by his first name and seems to like him well enough, which required me to sit with a complicated set of feelings for longer than I'd like to admit before arriving at something resembling peace. Owen having another adult who cares about him is a good thing. I am secure enough in who I am to my son to hold that truth without it diminishing anything. I got promoted last spring, Regional Operations Director, a title that comes with a salary I could not have imagined when I was stretching grocery budgets in the early years of my marriage. Bill Ostrowski shook my hand and told me he'd never seen anyone work with the kind of focused, quiet determination I had brought to the last 2 years. I thought about what had been fueling it and decided not to explain. I haven't started dating yet, people ask. I tell them I'm not ready, and that Owen is 3, and that I'm honestly fine. They look skeptical. Maybe they're right to. But I spent so much of my marriage trying to be enough for someone who wanted something else, and I find now that I am in no hurry to audition for that experience again. I am building something, not rushing anywhere. The life I am living is not the life I planned, but it is a real life, and it is mine, and Owen is in it. That is enough. I want to say one final thing, because I think it is the thing that matters most and the thing most likely to get lost in the outline of the story. On Christmas Eve of last year, Owen's third Christmas, the second one I hosted, the second one my mother drove down for, I sat on that same couch with my son asleep on my chest, the same tree. Different ornaments. Owen had picked a plastic dinosaur with a Santa hat from the school craft fair and insisted it go at the top. It sat there, slightly crooked, presiding over the whole room. I sat there in the dark with my son's weight warm against me, and I did not cry. Not because the pain was entirely gone. I think some grief becomes permanent, the way certain injuries leave a change in the weather in your bones. But because something had been built in the space where something had been broken, something real and earned, and mine in a way that nothing had ever been quite mine before. The lights blinked their soft gold against the dark. Owen breathed. Outside, it had started to snow. I thought, this is what I fought for, not revenge, not vindication, not to prove something to someone who had already moved on. I had fought for this room, this weight, this breathing. I had fought to be the person my son deserved, and I had won, and the winning looked like nothing dramatic. It looked like a crooked dinosaur with a Santa hat, and a child asleep on Christmas Eve, and a man sitting quietly in the knowledge that he had not broken. That's the whole story. That's all of it. I held my newborn and cried on Christmas. And then I got up.